Welcome back. The Bronx is historically known to endure the most severe effects of any disparity, and this winter is no different. Recent studies found the Bronx was the coldest borough with several heat complaints during frigid temperatures. Joining me to discuss the study is data scientist for RentHop, Shane Lee. Shane, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you go over the details of the study and what actually inspired it?
Sure. So as a rental website, our job is to help people find the right apartment, especially those who are new to the city. You renting in New York City is really tough in that, there are different types of properties you'll come across, but more so, the neighborhoods themselves are very different. So our ultimate goal with studies like this involving 311 complaints is to help New Yorkers and newcomers to better understand the city in each neighborhood so they can make an informed decision before signing the lease. In this particular study, we reviewed heat and hot water complaints that were filed in this heating season as of January 19th, and we compared that with previous year's data. We have three major discoveries. One, neighborhoods farther away from the city center have seen more complaints this year. And that has been historically true. Um, Complaints concentrate in certain neighborhoods in the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn, along with neighborhoods in the north part of Upper Manhattan. The second thing we noticed is that there's a negative correlation between rent and the number of complaints. That means landlords charging lower rents tend to be more negligent when it comes to turning on heat. And the last thing we discovered is that certain buildings have just been consistently complained throughout the years. So 2176 T-Bout Avenue is one great example. It's been the most complained building in the last 3 years. So is 2040 Bronxdale.
Now, were there any special variables or factors that you looked at during this study? For example, ethnicity or anything like that? I mean, you also mentioned rent. So, were there any other variables that you looked at?
So we looked at specifically rental prices because historically underserved neighborhoods have seen worse of a heat problem in New York City. We didn't analyze the data based on race or ethnicity, but if you look at the map, you can see that a lot of the neighborhoods that have seen worse of a problem this year are predominantly Hispanic or Black neighborhoods. So, for instance, Fordham South, which is the worst neighborhood this year, it's predominantly Hispanic, and so is Kingsbridge Heights. And even in Manhattan, we see the same thing. Um, Hamilton Heights, of all Manhattan neighborhoods, saw the most complaints, and it is 48% Hispanic and around 26% Black or African American.
So I'm so happy that you brought that up because I was kind of thinking about that. I was surprised to see like Manhattan had high numbers because everyone thinks of Manhattan as like, oh, money or like people who live there often have more. But I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
know if you found, and I guess you answered it a little bit, a difference in complaints based on zip code because people in poverty are usually the ones enduring the consequences of this neglect. So can you just further speak on that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the published version of this study, we included only data at the neighborhood level, but we actually did analyze key complaints based on zip code as well. And what we discovered is that there's a positive correlation between the number of unique complaints by zip code and percent of families below the poverty level. What this means that the more people below the poverty level, the more likely you're going to see a key complaint. And we also did something similar with median household income, and the results indicate that wealthier zip codes might not experience as much of an issue compared to neighborhood with lower median income.
Now, throughout the study, the term unique complaint was used several times. Can you explain what classifies as a unique complaint?
Of course. So because of the nature of rental buildings in New York City and how 311 complaints are logged and recorded, it's fairly common that tenants in the same building can report on the same problem within the same day. It's also not uncommon that the same tenants file multiple complaints within the same day due out of frustration. So for us to fairly measure how many days a building has gone without heat, we group them by day and location. What that means is no matter how many times a building is reported within a day, we count all of them as one unique complaint.
Interesting. Now, NYC has heat laws, and those heat laws require landlords to provide heat for all tenants. Have you found in your study that landlords are just simply ignoring this law?
Yeah, definitely in certain buildings. Some buildings have just been consistently making the list of worst buildings when it comes to heating violations. What we previously mentioned, 2176 T-Bow Avenue is a great example. This building has been reported 84 times as of January 19th, and that's in terms of unique complaints. So that means 84 days out of 110 days since October 1st, it's been reported. So since the temperature has dropped, tenants basically have just gone without any heat. And the same thing is with 2040 Bronxdale. That building has been reported a little bit better, 81 times, but it's still not better. So it's hard to say, exactly what's causing it, but based on what we see, we don't think landlords are necessarily doing their best in these particular buildings.
Now, that kind of leads into my next question because I wanted to know, based on the action of these landlords, is it a money issue, a lack of resources for the reason why they're not giving this heat, or could it just be simply unethical practices?
It really could be both. It depends on the building we're looking at. Again, it's hard for us to tell exactly from the other side what's going on. So we can only make plausible assumptions based on what we've seen with data. For small buildings managed by mom and pop landlords, sure, lack of resources could be a reason why they couldn't turn on heat. But if you look further into some of these buildings on the list, they are actually managed by people who operate multiple rental properties in the city. And that means they likely have the resources and staff to turn on the heat. So not providing heat could actually be a way to just to save money for them. And what tenants end up doing in these buildings is they put up space heaters, which is a huge fire hazard, but that also means they end up with expensive electricity bills that they have to pay. And all of their time is wasted on calling 311. The landlords, on the other side, they end up saving money on utilities.
Wow, I'm so happy that you broke that down because it's like all starting to make so much sense to me. So thank you so much for that. Now, if you take a look at the graph on your screen, we can actually see that this is a pattern and it's just been a consistent pattern. The Bronx always experiences the highest complaints while Staten Island sees the lowest. Can you explain why we continue to see this pattern?
Sure. So no doubt a lot of it is related to the types of property we're talking about. Staten Island has more single family homes, so the heating system might be different. And so is the relationship with the landlord. It might be a little bit easier to get in touch with your landlord. Neighborhoods in the Bronx are very different. The neighborhoods that are seeing the most complaints tend to be the ones with lots of rental units. So the process of getting in touch with your landlord is very different. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that large luxury rental properties in Manhattan or the gentrified parts of Brooklyn are not saying the same thing. So this goes back to it really could be related to the socioeconomic status of the tenants and what resources are made available for these tenants to push their landlords to fix the issue. Ultimately, it goes back to whether the tenants suffering have other options. We as a rental site see what people search for and the challenges they encounter. If you have the financial stability and credit history required to rent in New York, you might not put up with the same problem year after year. But if you don't, that's a problem.
Now, do you think the city is actually aware of this disparity and neglect that is happening? And if so, how should they be held responsible?
So it's unclear to us if the city is aware of the situation. I would assume that since the Department of Housing Preservation and Development does send inspectors when they receive a complaint, they probably have noticed that renters in certain neighborhoods tend to suffer more. The problem with the system is that it takes a really long time sometimes 14 days for HPD to respond to a complaint or issue a fine. So there's definitely some inefficiency there. But also, if you look at the current situation we're dealing with, it doesn't seem that the fines are actually effective. Uh, Buildings keep getting complained year after year. So it really might be time for the city to rethink how to hold landlords accountable and what tenant resources they could provide, not just a PDF that, heating season has started. Maybe instead of sending inspectors during the 9 to 5 window when they receive a complaint, they can make unannounced visits. The health department already does that to ensure food safety at restaurants. So maybe the same logic could work here to solve the heat problem.
So I'm just like really amazed and I just love the fact that this study was done. So once again, thank you. Can you let everybody know how they could actually learn more about the resources and just the studies that your organization provides?
Sure. We publish everything on renthop.com. So if you search for us, go to our blog, you'll see all the studies we do. We regularly do data studies on 301 complaints. We've covered poop complaints, and in this case, heat complaints. All of this is to help you better understand the neighborhood you live in, and if you were to move, where to go. If you're looking for ways to solve the heat problems, I think the best way is to rally people around you to join tenant coalitions. If necessary, call your congressional representative. I think these are the ways to generate awareness, and hopefully, change happens that way.
Shane, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.